Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Peter Biro, my guest tonight. He is the founder of a democracy organization called Section One, and he's got a conference coming up about democracy in the rearview mirror. And he's worried that democracy is challenged today, and that the insurrection that took place on January 6th a couple of years ago has actually won. Uh, Peter Biro, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you as always, Brian.
Tell me what's your concern here?
Well, this is a concern I've had for many years. I've been working on this problem of democratic backsliding throughout the Western world and indeed throughout the world, wherever countries identify themselves as being democratic. And that includes Canada as well. But more particularly, I'm concerned about the backsliding that occurs in so-called liberal constitutional or liberal democratic societies. And now, of course, we're facing this critical hinge moment, this constituent moment, as some people have referred to it, where everything is changing. It's changing because the backsliding has taken a dark and sinister turn, most obviously just south of the border, south of the 49th parallel in the great United States of America, where I contend certainly that that the insurrection that took place on January 6, 2021, and that really had been in the making for some time. I mean, Trump had been planning that for quite some time and laying the groundwork for it. That insurrection, notwithstanding the intervening period of a Biden administration, that insurrection has actually succeeded, and that today the coup is effectively unfolding in a, I don't want to say in an orderly way, but in an expeditious way, in a way that is deliberate and carefully planned, and that the United States is no longer a liberal democracy. Fundamentally, it is not. It is not operating as a liberal democracy, certainly at the federal level of government. We have a transformation of what was the world's shining example of liberal constitutional government, having transitioned into what I call an electoral autocracy. It's now run by the autocrats, principally Trump and his entourage, and of course, Elon Musk, the unelected, unaccountable sort of techno autocrat. It's now a kleptocracy. And there is the accountability mechanisms that are fundamental to any system of liberal constitutional government are completely ineffective. Not because they're not wonderful mechanisms, not because the laws that put those mechanisms in place aren't excellent laws, not because the institutions that were established in order to give effect to the protection of liberal constitutional values and the enforcement of those laws aren't wonderful institutions, but because the people entrusted with making the system work, with keeping it honest, have completely abandoned that function. So there is no longer an oversight branch of government in practice, although it's still there on paper, it's still there in bricks and mortar, but it's not operating in that way. We have an autocratic government with a Congress that has the oversight function that actually, when you study American constitutional law, would appear to be actually the strongest of the three branches of government, because it's the branch that holds the executive accountable. That is not functioning as an oversight branch at all. It's functioning as a kind of rubber stamp in the way that legislatures in pure dictatorships, such as Russia today, where the Duma functions as nothing more than a rubber stamp authorizing the president to do as he pleases. Well, that is exactly what's happening in the United States today. And that's not because a single comma of the Constitution was changed. It's not because a single law was changed. And in fact, it occurred at the ballot box. Democracies die at the ballot box. And we see a classic example of that here, as we did with Orban in Hungary, as we did with Erdogan in Turkey, and as we've seen elsewhere in the world. So it's a dramatic change. Now, when I say liberal democracy, doesn't operate in the United States government today, I'm not suggesting that there aren't ardent liberal Democrats in the United States, but they are not calling the shots, and they are not succeeding in holding government, particularly the executive branch of government, accountable. So what has happened here is not just that we have radical policies, many of which, by the way, Trump did not campaign on, that are being implemented. The big problem is that Trump, more than merely changing policies on fundamental questions and altering America's role in the world, changing the international order economically and politically and from a security standpoint, but more importantly, almost, he's seeking to change the system of government in the United States, and doing so, as I said, without changing a single comma in the Constitution and without a single shot being fired. So it's quite dramatic.
I guess if you said that we lose democracy at the ballot box, people are choosing that.
Well, that's certainly Elon Musk's argument. If you happen to hear him the other day standing in his alt-right fashionable uniform next to the Resolute desk, he was trying to lecture the American people on what democracy really means. But what he was really describing was a kind of demagoguery that is the product of what looks like an electoral process. It looks like it's the product of public choice, of the general will of the people, when if, in fact, it's nothing of the sort. One has to understand the way populist politics works to understand what sort of mandate is actually conferred by the people on an elected government. In this particular case, when a society essentially puts in office an executive or a government that eliminates the very systems of accountability that are there to protect the people who put them there, on the pretext that those kinds of changes, those kinds of reforms are precisely what the people called for or asked for. You have a kind of moral inversion, political inversion, that is Orwellian in its nature, but is anything but genuine mandate, genuine expression of the popular will. In one fell swoop, Trump eliminated many of the accountability mechanisms in place that he could by way of executive order, including getting rid of all the inspectors general, including dictating to the Senate-controlled, the Republican-controlled Senate, what their position was going to be on confirmation of his cabinet secretaries, including eliminating the conflict of interest and anti-corruption measures that were in place in order to simply allow him free reign without any checks and balances in place, all ostensibly on the basis that this is what the people wanted.
How would this be different from a Democrat president or some other Republican president that won both houses of government and controlled Congress? You have a situation where you've got a electorate that did vote for a Republican president, a Republican Senate, a Republican House of Representatives. You've got control in each one of those houses. How would that be different in some other situation?
Oh, that's an excellent and important question. My concerns have nothing to do with the partisan nature of this. It could be any party of any political stripe that undertakes this. This has nothing to do with gaining a mandate and controlling all the branches of government, save and except, of course, for the judiciary, which, by the way, Trump also thinks he controls. I neglected to mention that the independence of the judiciary is also on the chopping block here. But it's different in the sense that having control of Congress and the executive branch doesn't mean doing away with the accountability mechanisms in place. Let's not forget Howard Baker, the Republican senator in the Nixon years, who refused to go along with Richard Nixon's request for impunity from his fellow Republicans in the Senate. And he was the one who asked the question, what did the president know and when did he know it? People like him don't exist in the Republican Party anymore. Mitt Romney just left office. He was kind of the last independent-minded senator, Republican senator, left. And we saw that, he had been the presidential standard bearer not very long ago, just a decade and a bit ago for the Republican Party. And today, he wouldn't be allowed a party membership card if he applied for it. So the issue has to do with the accountability mechanisms. You play by the rules. Trump doesn't want to play by the rules. He wants to change them entirely. That's the difference. It's got nothing to do with winning an election and controlling all the branches of government, or certainly all of the legislative and executive branches of government.
This weekend, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
This weekend, Donald Trump tweeted out, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." What do you think about that?
Sounds like he's speaking like an emperor, or in Trump's case, more like a mafia don. He idolizes Vladimir Putin for his strength, for his unfettered control of Russian politics and Russian government, and wants nothing more, dreams of nothing more than to have that same hold over the politics and government of his own society. Those kinds of statements are the statements that have been uttered historically by dictators and by emperors who are accountable to no one other than themselves, unless you are a believer in the divine right of kings and claim to be accountable only to God. But in Trump's case, I'm certain that he would find God to be accountable to him and not the other way around.
We're chatting with Peter Biro tonight. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and come back and chat more about this conference that's coming up, his concerns about liberal democracy in the United States, and a little bit about Peter. So when we come back, I'm going to ask Peter to tell us a little bit about himself. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting guest, Peter Biro, with us tonight. He is a democracy and civics and public interest advocate. He's a lawyer. He's an educator. He's an adjunct professor. He's a writer. He's a corporate CEO. He's an NGO leader, and he's sometimes, get this, a songwriter. He's studying and combating democratic backsliding and defending and revitalizing liberal constitutionalism. And you, the founder of an organization called Section 1, Democracy Section 1. Tell me, what's that all about, Peter?
Well, thank you for asking. Section 1, first of all, takes its name and its inspiration from the first article of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 1, which is often referred to as the Reasonable Limits Clause, because that's the provision that lays out the framework for appropriate, acceptable justification for the restriction of rights by government. But it's also, and I refer to it generally as the Liberal Democracy Clause, because it's the clause that actually guarantees the fundamental freedoms of all Canadians. Section 1 is dedicated to, as you said in your remarks, combating democratic backsliding. First of all, understanding what liberal constitutionalism demands of us, what it means for the kinds of societal arrangements to which we can give our allegiance. And it is preoccupied with the decline of democracy all around us, including, of course, in Canada. We tend in Canada to be very smug about the quality of our democracy and the quality of the caliber of our democratic citizenship. And there's a lot of which we have to be quite proud, but certainly not smug. What you see happening south of the border in the United States and in other societies is also occurring here, because it is not merely a question of what leaders do and of what governments do when they transgress, these fundamental thresholds between uh, legitimate, the legitimate exercise of authority and the illegitimate, unacceptable exercise of power. It's also a question of what we as citizens are prepared to tolerate or to accept. A lot of the discussion and analysis around what's going on in the United States and elsewhere focuses on the actions of Trump and the leaders. And of course, it's quite right that we do focus on that and we do look at that. But we have to understand that leaders cannot get away with what they do unless a society is prepared to condone it, to be complicit in it in some way, or unless a society has been essentially conditioned into accepting the unacceptable, which is precisely what's happened in the United States. And it's happening here as well. Standards fall. The departure from adherence to norms and conventions isn't just a failing of leaders. Leaders will always make mistakes. They will always transgress. And as Lord Acton noted when he observed the corrupting influence of power, he was talking about human nature in general. People will make mistakes and they will go bad sometimes. The issue is not whether that occurs. And that's not the hallmark of a good or a bad or a just or an unjust society. The hallmark is whether there's an appropriate accountability mechanism in place to make things right. And leaders can't get away with what leaders do unless a society is prepared to tolerate it. Excuse me. Which is what's occurred in the United States and which is what occurs in Canada every bit as much.
Yeah, so let me talk about that a little bit. With a majority government in Canada, the prime minister, who is also the leader of a party, picks the cabinet. There's no approval process that the cabinet minister picks, that the prime minister makes in the Senate or in the House of Commons. The prime minister just decides. And so when you complain about the lack of Senate oversight in the United States. Well, we don't have that in Canada for cabinet picks. When the prime minister wants to get rid of a justice minister or a health minister because they're no longer towing the line, he can do that. And they leave the party and aren't welcome anymore. Some people have said that there was a cult of personality within the Liberal Party over the course of the last couple of years, and people that didn't feel comfortable with that strategy and direction weren't comfortable within the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party leader, and I think it's probably the same in the Conservative Party and the NDP Party, choose who can stand for nomination. You don't have a primary process like you do in the United States that are even as open as I believe they are in the United States. They're more closed, and so therefore they've got even, frankly, it would appear more control over who can be candidates for the party in a political process. So is Canada better or worse than the United States?
It's neither better nor worse in terms of its model of government. We've got a Westminster system of parliamentary government. The Americans have a Madisonian model with a president and a separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch, which is also the oversight branch of Congress. And then, of course, there's the judiciary. We also have a robust system of accountable mechanisms in Canada. It's true that a majority government gives a prime minister in the Westminster style parliamentary system much greater power, at least on paper, than an American president has constitutionally. Trump is obviously changing that. But it's also true that the government in a parliamentary system is accountable to Parliament, or in the case of the provinces, to the provincial legislatures. And of course, we have the courts. And we have periodic elections. So the accountability mechanisms work differently. The problem is not that governments with strong mandates can do as they please, at least for a time. The question is whether, again, there's an appropriate degree of transparency, of accountability, and of remedial recourse for aggrieved citizens when governments transgress, when governments exercise power in a way that infringes or restricts civil liberties or fundamental freedoms. That's the question. What I was focusing on wasn't the formal system of government, whether it's Madisonian or Westminster government. I was talking about the social psychology at work in a society in which people are prepared to accept the unacceptable because they get used to it. It's a process of habituation. The late American Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan coined a phrase, defining deviancy down. And he was referring to this notion that as the transgressions of government become more grave, more serious, more ugly, more unacceptable, over time, people come to tolerate them. That behavior and those standards, those lower standards and those increasingly lowering standards become normalized. And society begins to simply accept that which in a prior period, in a prior epoch, would have appeared to be scandalous, is now so normalized that it's not even noticeable, let alone objectionable. That's a process of social psychology that occurs everywhere, and it's occurring here. And let's not kid ourselves. The lowering of standards in American civic culture is affecting our own standards here in Canada, and indeed the standards of observers and societies around the world. But you are right to point out that a Canadian prime minister, particularly in a majority government, has a great deal of power. That isn't the problem. Again, the issue is the accountability mechanisms in place and the level of tolerance that a society has, or to put it differently, the amount of indifference that exists to what are obviously transgressions. And I can give you examples of that if you.
Yeah, no, I think it'd be interesting to get some examples, but I guess I've got to ask you, are these lowering of standards, or are they what the people want? I get the impression that Americans wanted a strong president. They were tired of what they determined was a weak president and wokeism and apologetic attitudes, and they wanted someone that was going to be like Putin. They wanted someone that was going to, not Putin from a militarist standpoint. Well, who knows? We'll talk about that. But from a strong man standpoint, someone that would stand up for what they would believe. They want this person that was a very successful business person. They wanted someone that was going to tell the rest of the world where they were wrong. They wanted that strength. And you think about the images that we've all seen if we've traveled in the United States of the huge, big pickup trucks with exhaust roaring and flags waving and bumper stickers yelling out. They wanted that strong man. It's not lowering standards. It's what they wanted, Peter.
Okay. And I don't disagree with you for a moment. It's also what they've been conditioned to want for a long period of time. Political discourse has been dumbed down to a ridiculous point in the United States and, in fact, in Canada and around the world. We have been turned into stupid people, entertaining stupid discussions about stupid notions. Reason, science, evidence-based policy thinking has been sidelined and supplanted by conspiracy thinking, by absolutely crazy notions that have themselves been normalized in our discourse. Trump and a whole coterie of fellow travelers, if you will, in the United States and around the world have been promoting ideas that effectively dumb down the discourse. Trump has been working for many, many years now. In fact, long before he began his first run for the presidency, to try to influence the discourse around notions that are ridiculous for the purpose of sowing distrust in our system. It's the Russian approach, right? It's the disinformation approach. I mean, just think back to the days when the birther controversy, when Barack Obama's actual birth certificate was a live controversy, a ridiculous, preposterous notion to begin with. You repeat that lie enough times, it becomes important, it becomes an accepted truth or a half truth, it becomes a serious talking point. Now, that is one almost silly example of something that became institutionalized in the political discourse of the United States, particularly, courtesy of Donald Trump and his coterie of friends. So you are absolutely right in what you say. People want, to some degree, what they've got. Polls show that the people who voted for Trump are delighted with what he is doing now. So you're 100% right. But you have to appreciate that what people think they want is what they've been conditioned to want, and certainly not what is in their best interest. There's some wonderful ironies here. There's a phenomenon called acrasia, which is essentially acting against your own self-interest. Just think of this. It's true that there were genuine grievances, and liberal democracy has failed to keep some of its fundamental promises. So the grievances are justified. Americans of a certain class have been truly left behind, and in some ways disenfranchised, disempowered. But here's the irony. While they have been rendered poorer and poorer by the day over the last number of decades, they've and while the story has been that economic inequality and high concentrations of power and of wealth are the product of a liberal democratic system that has gone awry and betrayed society ever since the post-war period. The irony is that the people at the very helm of the political party that has seized power, and I say seized because I do refer to the insurrection and to the coup that's proceeding in stages now, right? That has actually seized power and is continuing to take it and to reshape the government, is the very class of people against whom the voters for that political party ought to have the strongest grievances. The wealthiest man in the world, the most unaccountable man in the world, who's now also the most powerful man in the world, is purporting to act on the basis of the electoral mandate given to Trump by the very people most harmed by the concentration of wealth and power that this man, Elon Musk, and some of the other techno oligarchs represents. That's quite an irony.
How can he be the most powerful man in the world if Trump loses faith in him, confidence in him, he's gone. Doesn't have an electoral position, doesn't have a permanent position, doesn't have an official position. He's there at the invitation of Donald Trump.
That's what you perhaps may think. He's there because he controls the true levers of power. He owns a critical piece of the technological and security infrastructure worldwide. He has his fingers in critical, politically, militarily critical sectors in countries all over the world, including in China. He's in talks on a regular basis with Putin, either directly or indirectly, while he controls Starlink, the very satellite system on which Ukraine depends in order to conduct its military defense. He controls outer space right now. He practically owns it. He has privatized outer space and certainly space travel. He controls a big chunk of the technology around artificial intelligence and around renewable energy. He controls so much that his power is not the product of any electoral mandate. He would be equally powerful or almost equally powerful even had Kamala Harris won the election. He's now in a position where his power on its face looks clear, and he holds it in a literal fashion. I mean, he's going in with the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and with the click of a mouse, deleting, as he calls it, deleting entire agencies and departments, and dismissing critical workforces. But his power doesn't depend on the election of Donald Trump, doesn't depend on any one political leader in office in the United States or elsewhere. The only thing that can stop Donald Trump is some kind of a democratic, small d democratic popular resistance or revolution that displaces him as the key stakeholder in each of the major technologies that will determine the future trajectory of the world. That's where his power is derived from. It's got little or nothing to do with Donald Trump.
We're chatting tonight with Peter Biro, talking about the backsliding of democracy. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back just in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Peter, I got to ask you about a post you made just a couple of weeks ago, because it really suggested that the concerns that you have are far wider than just the United States. And then you wrote, "A constituent moment is upon us, and we are nowhere near prepared for it." Thomas Homer Dixon's article, which was published in the Globe and Mail and was titled "Thomas Trump Redux: Why the Returning President is Likely to Become One of the Most Consequential Figures in History." You said it is compulsory reading for the political and business classes and for the citizenry at large. He and others, myself included, have been warning about the cataclysmic change that is occurring. In my case, it has been through the lens of democratic backsliding, which we've been talking about, and the evisceration of liberal constitutionalism. Homer Dixon's canvas is much larger. It is global. Indeed, it is planetary. These warnings are part air-raid siren, part call to collective nonpartisan action and cooperation. May we manage to take shelter in the bunkers while simultaneously heeding the call to action. You're worried, he's worried, that Trump is going to have an impact not just in the United States, but about our whole world. Why?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, he's been in office now for less than a month. And you can already feel the impact in every corner of the world. Just looking at it from a policy perspective. And again, as I said earlier, Trump's interest is not really a policy interest. He's actually not an ideologue, for example, the way that Elon Musk is, and the way that J.D. Vance clearly is. And that, came out loud and clear if you heard his talk at the Munich Security Conference just a few days ago. In the case of Trump, he's trying to change the system of government, and he's changing the international order at the same time, because many of the assumptions about liberal internationalism in the post-war period are being trashed as we speak. They have been eviscerated by Trump. He used to, say things in a kind of quasi satirical way. He would talk about NATO, suggesting, well, maybe we don't need NATO, maybe we don't need the Paris climate agreements. Now it's very, very clear that what he really means is we don't need the international order that we had before, because first of all, the core assumptions of that order no longer operate. They no longer apply. The values that we care most about in the post-war period was, in fact, the values of liberal democracy, of civil liberties, of civil rights, of human rights, of fair distribution of resources and broad prosperity, of peace, and of fairness in the world. None of that is meaningful anymore. To speak in that nomenclature using those terms is to sound silly in today's political climate, to, to embarrass oneself, to promote values like that, which is why, by the way, Justin Trudeau looks so silly on the international stage now, because you don't speak words to evil. You don't speak words to power. You have to understand what's really going on in order to meet the challenge. What we've got now is a new international order that will be defined by power relations, by a predatory approach to how the spoils of the earth are divvied up. Look at what Trump has done around the Ukraine-Russia war. Just this morning, a Trump official very, very kindly and generously said, don't worry, Ukraine will have a seat at the table in these peace talks. Peace talks that are being orchestrated, and I say peace in quotation marks. It really means just parceling out the spoils the way that Putin wants them parceled out and the way that Trump is prepared to go along with. Ukraine will have a seat at the table. Think about what that means. When the aggression of 2014 that gave Russia Crimea, and of just 3 or 4 years ago that gave Russia the entire eastern flank of Ukraine, that's no longer seen as a war of aggression. The President of the United States this week essentially justified Putin's invasion by saying, well, we should never have talked about NATO membership for the Ukraine or European membership for the Ukraine. Putin was justified. I mean, what kind of leader of Russia would ever tolerate such talk, such notions? The idea that the values that underpin what NATO is about, what the EU is about, what the Paris Climate Accords were about, the notion of international cooperation, what USAID was about, the notion of international development and a responsibility of the great powers to the less fortunate in the world, or the use of aid as soft power to calm the waters in troubled parts of the world. All of that has fallen by the wayside. We have a predatory president who's changing the entire global order, who's talking about tariffs as warfare. His aim is to hurt Canada very, very badly. And we sit here naively thinking that it's all about dealing with the fentanyl problem or the immigration problem, these pretexts that he uses to justify something that has absolutely nothing to do with policies of any kind or particular concerns that he may have of any kind.
So you really seriously think that he wants to take over Canada? He wants to annex Canada?
The issue is not annexation. The issue is to inflict harm and pain. What he wants to do is to inflict harm and pain. Canada represents, in North America and in the world, the model of liberal constitutional values. Donald Trump opposes liberal constitutionalism with every fiber of his being. He wants to be a dictator. It's the only thing he understands. He doesn't understand any system of accountability. When asked about whether Elon Musk going into the Defense Department was going to fall prey to his own conflicts of interest, Donald Trump's response was no, he would never do that. And in any case, don't worry, I won't let him do that. His notion of accountability is the imperial one. It's the discretion that is unfettered and absolute, the discretion of kings and emperors and dictators. He's regulated by his own narcissistic, deeply insecure personal psychology. People are looking at fentanyl and the crossing of the borders of immigrants in Quebec into Vermont, when what's really going on in Trump's head is that, the Trump commercial ventures in Canada didn't succeed. Trump signs came down in both Toronto and in Vancouver during his first tenure. So people in Canada didn't love Trump. Uh, there's the famous picture of Melania Trump looking glowingly, almost longingly, into the eyes of Justin Trudeau in 2017 when they met. Uh, do not for one moment believe that Trump isn't motivated by resentment, insecurity, jealousy, anger, and personal ambition. That is how we have to understand his moves. He wants to be an emperor. He wants to be like Putin, only bigger, better, and more powerful. That is what he longs for. If we don't understand that psychology, we will not understand anything. While the pundits run around trying to rationalize or to understand what does he want, how does this advance American, interest in economically, militarily, or otherwise, they're missing the point completely. This can only be understood through the lens of psychology, both the social psychology of the aggrieved Trump supporters and the personal psychology of Trump. The
So
Constitution be damned.
I do business in the United States and talk to a lot of people, as you undoubtedly do as well. My sense is that there's a group of Americans that love this, that they wanted the strong man. They thought that America was being taken advantage of, that America was being weak, that America was being woke. And I keep hearing this woke word over and over and over again. I'm still not sure exactly what it means, but I hear it constantly, um, and um, and they're proud that they have a president that can change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and they're all calling it the Gulf of America and are incensed that the rest of the world doesn't accept it right away and is proud that Google has changed it so promptly. That want to have guns that they can carry undisclosed, that want that sort of that Lone Ranger Western Maverick, on top of the horse Marlboro Man kind of attitude. That's who they define themselves as. And then there's another group that are sort of resigned and think, oh, this will pass, and like they're a little bit embarrassed about it, and but they're not going to do much about it because there's not much they can do, and they're just going to let it pass and hope that in 2 years that the Democrats take over control of the House of Representatives. Tell me what can be done given
Well,
your
first of all, the group that is resigned and is just waiting for an election to change the picture is delusional. It will not pass. And in any event, if and when a Democrat again takes the Oval Office in some future election, or the Democrats take control of one or both of the houses of Congress, that doesn't change the fundamental transformation, doesn't reverse the transformation that's occurred. What you said about that very large constituency in the United States that is happy about this or proud of it is absolutely right. But let's just try to parse this out a little bit. We have to distinguish between legitimate policy issues around protectionism, kind of trade policies we want to have, people feeling very unhappy that large swaths of the manufacturing infrastructure have been outsourced to other parts of the world. Labor is cheaper elsewhere. Production costs are lower elsewhere. Those are legitimate questions for society to think about. And the idea that that the protectionist impulse is now sort of coming to the fore, that's fine. All right. And the idea that people want strong leadership, that's also fine. That is not the issue at all. The issue has to do with what kinds of accountability institutions and mechanisms people really care about. Americans have now been conditioned to be completely indifferent to accountability altogether, to lose sight of the critical importance of that accountability for their own freedom, for their own well-being. That's the problem. The problem isn't that people want a strong president. The question of whether they want the kind of strength that can't tolerate oversight and accountability. Well, there's a line that is a bridge too far, in my view. People who are happy with a king or an emperor today won't be so happy when the king or emperor tomorrow acts on his own pleasure to disempower and disenfranchise those very people who put him in office. It's precisely what strongmen all over the world have done, from Mussolini to Orban to Erdogan. One can go down the list of leaders who began as liberal reformers and who, through the ballot box, evolved into strongmen, into demagogues, and effectively electoral autocrats and dictators. So what you've identified is quite correct, and there's some justification for wanting strength in leadership, particularly when you've seen weakness in leadership or when you've seen bad leadership and you want something different. But that's a very, very different issue than whether you're prepared to tolerate or whether you actually long for or would be, give your tacit consent to an overthrow of the Constitution itself. And that is what is occurring before our eyes.
We have to take a final break, and we're going to come back with a few concluding comments in just 2 minutes with Peter Biro. Stay with us, everybody. Please. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Fascinating conversation with Peter Biro today, worried about what's going on in the United States and a backsliding of liberal democracy and a conference he's got coming up to address this. Peter, I got to ask you, we're faced in Canada with a couple of choices, and to try to get out of the different politics and personalities for a second and think about sort of the type of person that is best to elect. It almost appears we have maybe three options right now. We can go with the global technocrat, which would appear to be the complete opposite of what Donald Trump is all about. The person that believes in the UN, believes in NATO, believes in globalization, has gone to Davos numerous times, has been an international monetary economic expert. So that's sort of the global technocrat that appears to be the opposite of everything that you've just described. This past weekend, we had the Canada First, which would appear to be a Canadian version of what Trump is. It's Canada First. It's nationalism. It's strongman. It's standing up for Canada. It would appear to be a Canadian version of Trump. That sounds like he might like it. He might actually respect someone that stands up for their country, just like he is standing up for his. And then we've got the person that he says was toxic and was a terrible negotiator and appears to rattle him. Sometimes with that strong person, a rattler, a toxic personality, a person that just gets under your skin is kind of helpful. What do you think about those three different potential choices Canada has?
Right. Well, I don't think that any one of those choices, because of the characteristics you identified, are going to be better or worse versus Trump. What we need is a leader who's not just prepared to stand up for Canada, but who is prepared to force Canadians to take their bitter medicine, meaning to suffer some pain in order to rehabilitate our sovereignty, our autonomy, because it's our sovereignty that is at issue here. Trying to pick a Canadian leader based on the likability factor in the Oval Office is a mug's game. We absolutely cannot choose someone who would appease Trump. Seeking to appease Trump doesn't work. He doesn't respect appeasers. He doesn't respect flatterers. In fact, he has no respect for them. He tolerates them because they enable him. But they have no bargaining position of their own. So it's not a question of style in this particular case. It's going to be, for Canada, a question of strong leadership, of someone who's prepared to look not Trump in the eye, but Canadians in the eye and say, our sovereignty is on the line. We can't force Trump to backtrack on his tariff threat. We'll continue to lobby and make the best case we can. But what we need to do is to tighten our belts, sit down and do the hard work of actually building our own economy and of developing a military that is woefully inadequate and ill-prepared to fend for itself in a world where we have become very, very lax and all too dependent on the United States, both economically, in terms of the supply chain uh, connection with the United States, and militarily. And I mean, for all we know, NORAD can go out the window now. Not just NATO, but NORAD, North American Defense Treaty between Canada and the United States, because Trump has made it clear that he may not defend Canada in the event, and he said that Canada is in no position to defend itself, neither economically nor militarily. So I don't think style is going to be the issue. It's going to be substance, and it's going to be a question of whether the next Canadian leader is prepared to force Canadians to look in the mirror and to understand that we have some serious work to do and some serious pain to suffer to get to where we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet. That's what Trump will not so much respect, but have no choice but to contend with.
Peter Biro, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to your conference and what the results are, and I look forward to chatting with you again. I think that you put forward a wake-up call for Canada. There's just no question about it. And I like how you say that we've got to think about our constituent responsibilities. I think that we all have to play a role collectively, whether it's at the ballot box or in support of the type of individual, the type of leader that you've described. Because I think Canada needs desperately to regain our sovereignty, regain our pride, and put ourselves militarily, economically, and domestically in the best place possible to combat this threat to Canada. So thank you, Peter, for making that wake-up call.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are on my website, briancrombie.com, and all of the videos go up on social media, and the audio goes up on podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody.